As the massive black stallion that had injured 3 men charged toward 12-year-old Elijah, the mute boy whispered the first words he'd spoken in 8 months, words only the horse could hear, words that would unearth the violent truth behind his parents' deaths. Deaths. The small town of Widow's Creek, nestled in the rolling hills of Montana, wasn't accustomed to mysteries. Life moved with predictable rhythms. Farmers tended their fields, shopkeepers opened promptly at 8, and Sheriff Dawson made his rounds with clockwork precision. But 2 enigmas had recently disrupted this carefully maintained order, leaving the townsfolk unsettled and whispering behind closed doors. The first was 12-year-old Elijah Morrison, who hadn't spoken a single word in the 8 months since the fire that claimed his parents' lives. The second was the massive black stallion that had appeared during a violent thunderstorm 3 months ago. A horse so wild and dangerous that even the most experienced handlers in the county couldn't approach it without risking life and limb. "That boy ain't right," muttered Martha Wilson from behind the counter of her general store as she watched Elijah walk past, his eyes fixed on the ground, shoulders hunched against the world. "Hasn't said a word since the accident, not one single word." Tom Fletcher nodded in agreement as he gathered his purchases. Tragedy like that changes a person. Sarah and Michael were good folks. Terrible way to go. The fire had started in the middle of the night, consuming the Morrison farmhouse with terrifying speed. By the time neighbors arrived, the structure was engulfed. How Elijah had escaped remained a mystery. He'd been found huddled behind the barn, soot-covered and wide-eyed, watching his world burn. The boy now lived with his elderly grandmother on the edge of town, walking to school each day in silence, returning home in silence, existing as though he were a ghost among the living. "That horse is even stranger," Tom continued, lowering his voice. "Nearly killed Peterson last week. Broke his arm in 2 places when he tried to saddle him. Third man, it's injured," Martha replied. "Sheriff's talking about putting it down if no one can tame it by the end of the month. Says it's a public menace." The stallion had appeared out of nowhere during a thunderstorm that had flooded half the county. Jake Miller had found it standing in his pasture the next morning, magnificent and wild-eyed, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian. No one claimed ownership, though flyers had been posted throughout 3 counties. After the animal had kicked through a wooden fence and trampled Miller's prized tomato garden, the town council had paid to construct a reinforced paddock behind the livery stable. "There's something unnatural about that beast," Martha said, crossing herself. "Eyes glow in the dark, they say. Won't take food from human hands. Nearly took off Reynolds' finger when he offered it an apple." Outside, Elijah continued his solitary journey home from school, his threadbare backpack bouncing slightly against his narrow shoulders. At 12, he was small for his age, with a shock of unruly brown hair that his grandmother couldn't tame, and eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Eyes that had witnessed things no child should see. As he passed the livery stable, he paused, his attention drawn to the paddock where the black stallion paced restlessly. Man and beast regarded each other across the distance, the boy still and watchful, the horse alert and wary. For a brief moment, something passed between them, a current of recognition that defied explanation. "Get away from there, boy!" shouted Maxwell, the stablemaster, waving his arms. "But that devil will take your arm off." Elijah didn't acknowledge the warning. He simply turned and continued on his way, but his pace was slower now, his eyes no longer fixed on the ground, but looking toward the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering. Another storm was coming. His grandmother, Eleanor Morrison, was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her arthritic hands working at her knitting despite the pain. "Storm's coming," she observed as Elijah climbed the steps. "Best get the shutters closed before it hits." She didn't expect a response, hadn't heard her grandson's voice since the night of the fire when he'd been brought to her door, traumatized and orphaned in a single, terrible stroke of fate. The doctors called it selective mutism, a response to extreme trauma. They said he might speak again when he was ready, or he might never find his voice again. Either way, Eleanor had learned to live with the silence, to read his expressions and gestures, to provide what comfort she could in a world that had proven itself cruel beyond measure. As Elijah began securing the shutters, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. The wind picked up, bending the old oak tree in the yard, sending leaves skittering across the dusty ground. And in the paddock behind the livery stable, the mysterious black stallion raised its head, nostrils flaring, as if scenting something on the coming storm that only it could perceive. Sheriff Dawson slammed his coffee mug down on his desk, spilling a few drops onto the daily report he'd been reading. 3 injuries in 3 weeks, Maxwell. That's not counting the property damage. I can't have a killer horse in my town. Maxwell, who'd been handling horses for 40 years, shifted uncomfortably. I ain't never seen nothing like it, Sheriff. It's like that animal understands exactly what will hurt most. Peterson swears it waited until he turned his back before it struck. Reynolds needs 20 stitches in his hand, Dawson continued, counsels breathing down my neck. If you can't find someone to handle that beast by the end of the month, I'll have no choice but to put it down. Thunder crashed outside, rattling the windows of the sheriff's office. The storm had arrived with unexpected ferocity, sending townsfolk scurrying for shelter. Rain lashed against the glass in sheets, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts of white-hot fury. You ever notice how that horse gets more agitated during storms? Maxwell asked, gazing out at the downpour. Like it's connected to the lightning somehow. Dawson rolled his eyes. Don't you start with that superstitious nonsense too. I've got half the town telling me that beast is possessed. Mrs. Abernathy claims she saw its eyes glowing red last week. Not saying it's supernatural, Maxwell defended. Just saying it ain't natural neither. At the livery stable, the black stallion was living up to its reputation. It paced the reinforced paddock with increasing agitation as the storm intensified, occasionally rearing up on powerful hind legs, forelegs pawing at the air. Its coat, slick with rain, gleamed under each flash of lightning, and its eyes reflected the electric bursts in a way that did indeed make them appear to glow. The single stable hand, who remained during the storm, watched nervously from the shelter of the doorway. "Easy there," he called, though his voice trembled. "Easy, boy." The horse responded with a scream that sounded almost human in its rage and desperation. It charged the paddock fence, slamming its massive body against the reinforced timbers with such force that the entire structure shuddered. Wood cracked ominously. Jesus! The stable hand fumbled for his phone. "Maxwell, it's breaking out!" 3 miles away, in the modest home he shared with his grandmother, Elijah Morrison sat bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide in the darkness. Another crack of thunder shook the house to its foundations, but it wasn't the storm that had awakened him. It was something else. A feeling, a connection, a pull he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. He slipped from beneath his covers and padded to the window, pressing his face against the glass. Rain obscured his view, but in the distance, with each flash of lightning, he could just make out the town center. Something was happening there, something that called to him with an urgency he hadn't felt since the night of the fire. Eleanor Morrison found her grandson's bed empty 20 minutes later. "Elijah?" she called, her voice tight with worry as she checked each room of their small house. When she reached the front door and found it unlocked, her heart nearly stopped. "Elijah!" But the boy was already halfway to town, soaked to the skin, his bare feet splashing through puddles, his thin pajamas plastered to his body. He moved with single-minded determination, oblivious to the rain, the cold, the thunder that crashed around him. He was answering a call that only he could hear. In town, chaos reigned. The black stallion had indeed broken free, smashing through the paddock fence with a strength that seemed impossible even for an animal of its size. It now stood in the town square, rearing and screaming its defiance as Maxwell, Sheriff Dawson, and 3 other men attempted to corner it with ropes and poles. "Don't get too close," Dawson shouted over the storm. "That thing's more dangerous than ever." A small crowd of onlookers had gathered despite the hour and the weather, watching from porches and from behind the windows of surrounding buildings. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark relief. The magnificent horse, wild and untamed, surrounded by men who both feared and desired to control it. "It's going to kill someone tonight," Martha Wilson whispered from the safety of her store's covered entrance. "Lord help us all." As if to prove her right, the stallion charged suddenly, scattering the men like bowling pins. Maxwell went down hard, clutching his leg. Sheriff Dawson barely managed to roll out of the way of deadly hooves. The horse reared again at the center of the square, triumphant and terrifying in its power. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a small figure emerged. Barefoot, soaked, apparently oblivious to the danger, Elijah Morrison walked slowly into the square, his eyes fixed on the raging stallion. "Get that boy out of there!" Dawson bellowed, struggling to his feet. "Someone grab him!" But no one moved. They all stood frozen, watching in horror and fascination as the 12-year-old orphan approached the beast that had injured grown men without hesitation or apparent fear. Time seemed to slow as Elijah approached the stallion. The rain fell in sheets around them, but neither boy nor beast seemed to notice. The onlookers held their collective breath, certain they were about to witness a tragedy. "Elijah, stop!" Eleanor Morrison had arrived, breathless and terrified, her nightgown soaked and muddy from her desperate pursuit of her grandson. She lunged forward, but Sheriff Dawson caught her arm. "Don't," he warned. "You'll spook the horse. It'll kill you both." The stallion's ears flicked forward as Elijah drew nearer. Its nostrils flared, taking in his scent. The wild rage in its eyes remained, but now there was something else too. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. Its massive body, trembling with adrenaline, tensed as if preparing to charge. "Please, God," Eleanor whispered, tears mingling with the rain on her face. "Please protect him." The horse pawed the ground, sending mud spattering. Its breath came in great, steaming huffs in the cool night air. Elijah stopped just 10 feet away from the animal, close enough that one charge would bring those deadly hooves crashing into his small frame. And then the impossible happened. The boy's lips moved. After 8 months of silence, Elijah Morrison spoke. Not to the people watching in horrified fascination, but to the wild stallion that had terrorized their town. No one could hear what he said over the storm. His words were carried away by the wind and rain, meant only for the ears of the massive beast before him. But everyone saw the effect. The stallion's aggressive posture softened, its head lowered slightly, the murderous fury in its eyes dimmed. "What in God's name?" Maxwell breathed, still clutching his injured leg. Elijah took another step forward, still speaking in that soft, inaudible voice. The stallion remained motionless, watching him intently. Another step, then another. The distance between them closed to mere feet, then inches. Sheriff Dawson's hand moved instinctively to his holster. "If that thing makes one wrong move," he muttered. But the wrong move never came. Instead, with infinite gentleness, Elijah raised his hand and placed it on the stallion's muzzle. The horse released a long, shuddering breath, not the angry scream they'd all come to fear, but something that sounded almost like relief. "It's not possible," Martha Wilson said, her hand pressed against her mouth. "That animal nearly killed 3 grown men. yet the evidence was before their eyes. The stallion that had been untouchable, untamable, that had lashed out with lethal intent at anyone who approached, stood perfectly still under the touch of a 12-year-old boy. More than that, it lowered its massive head until its forehead pressed against Elijah's chest in a gesture that looked remarkably like submission, or perhaps comfort. Eleanor Morrison sank to her knees in the mud, overwhelmed by relief and confusion. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" As the initial shock subsided, Maxwell limped forward cautiously. "Boy," he called, keeping his voice low and even. "Can you bring him back to the stable? Nice and easy?" For a moment, it seemed Elijah hadn't heard. He remained with his hand on the stallion's muzzle, their foreheads touching in that strange communion. Then, slowly, he nodded. He didn't speak again, his brief words to the horse apparently depleting whatever had broken through his months of silence. But he gently took hold of the horse's mane and began to lead it back toward the livery. The stallion followed with unexpected docility, its earlier rage seemingly forgotten. The crowd parted wordlessly, creating a path through which boy and horse walked together through the rain. "I don't believe what I'm seeing," Sheriff Dawson said, holstering his weapon. "That's the same animal that's been raising hell for 3 months. Maxwell shook his head in wonder. "Same one, but it sure ain't acting the same." At the stable, Elijah led the stallion not back to its reinforced paddock with its now broken fence, but into one of the regular stalls. The horse entered without hesitation, turning once inside to face the boy. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, communicating in some silent language that none of the watching adults could comprehend. Then, with obvious reluctance, Elijah backed away. Maxwell quietly closed and secured the stall door. Though it seemed unnecessary now, the stallion made no move to escape, merely watching as Elijah was finally enfolded in his grandmother's trembling embrace. "Are you scared years off my life?" Eleanor whispered, holding him tightly. "Don't you ever do that again." Sheriff Dawson approached cautiously, his eyes moving between the now calm horse and the silent boy. "Son," he said gently, "I need to ask you something important. Do you know this horse? Have you met it before tonight?" Elijah didn't respond verbally, but his eyes, always so guarded, so filled with unspoken pain, flickered with something that might have been recognition. "Sheriff," Maxwell called softly from where he stood examining the stallion. "There's something you should see." Dawson moved to join the stablemaster, who was pointing to a small, irregular mark on the horse's left flank, a white patch in the shape of a crescent moon, barely visible against the gleaming black coat. "I've seen that mark before," Maxwell said, his voice hushed with realization. "Years ago." "This ain't just any horse, Sheriff." "What are you saying?" Maxwell turned to look at Elijah, who stood watching them with his grandmother's protective arm around his shoulders. "I'm saying this horse belonged to Michael Morrison. That's Thunder, the stallion Michael raised from a colt before he was married. The one that disappeared during that big storm 5 years back. The boy's father owned this horse," Dawson whispered, understanding dawning. "Not just owned," Maxwell replied. "Saved its life. That animal was loyal to Michael, like I've never seen a horse loyal to a man." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "That's why," she began, looking down at her grandson with new understanding. "Oh, Elijah, is that true?" "You recognized Thunder." The boy didn't speak, but his eyes filled with tears for the first time since the night of the fire. And that was answer enough. Word spread through Widow's Creek with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By noon the following day, everyone knew that the devil horse was actually Thunder, Michael Morrison's prized stallion, long thought lost. and that silent Elijah had somehow tamed the untamable beast with nothing more than a whisper. The livery stable had become an impromptu gathering place, with townsfolk finding flimsy excuses to stop by and witness the miracle for themselves. What they saw left them shaking their heads in wonder. The stallion that had terrorized the town for months now stood quietly in his stall, his demeanor completely transformed whenever Elijah was present. "It's like they're having a conversation," Martha Wilson remarked to anyone who would listen. The boy doesn't speak, not to us anyway, but that horse watches him like it understands every thought in his head. Eleanor Morrison sat on a hay bale outside Thunder's stall, watching her grandson brush the stallion's gleaming coat. The horse nickered softly, pushing his muzzle against Elijah's shoulder with surprising gentleness. "And Michael loved that horse more than anything," she said quietly to Sheriff Dawson, who had come to check on the situation. "Until he met Sarah, of course, and later when Elijah was born. But there was always a special bond there." Dawson leaned against the stable wall, his expression thoughtful. "Maxwell says Michael saved the horse when it was just a colt." Eleanor nodded, her eyes never leaving her grandson. "Does found him half dead in a ditch during a thunderstorm, if you can believe it. Some idiot had abandoned him there, barely breathing, leg broken. Any sensible person would have put him down." "But Michael wasn't always sensible," Dawson said with a small smile. He'd known Michael Morrison well. Everyone in Widow's Creek had. "No," Eleanor agreed. "He brought that muddy, half-dead colt home and slept in the barn with him for 2 weeks straight. Hand-fed him, set his leg, talked to him through the night when the pain was bad." Her voice grew softer. "I think that's why the horse disappeared after Michael married Sarah and moved to the new property. That storm knocked down the fence and Thunder just left. Michael was heartbroken, searched for months. But I always thought maybe the horse was jealous, somehow." "Sounds foolish, I know." "Not so foolish," Dawson replied, watching as Thunder gently nuzzled Elijah's hair. "Animals feel things we don't always understand." Inside the stall, Elijah continued his methodical grooming, his small hands moving confidently over the massive animal's body. Though he hadn't spoken again since that moment in the storm, something in him had changed. The emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a spark of life, of purpose. "He's the spitting image of his father," Maxwell observed, joining Eleanor and the sheriff. "Got the same way with animals too. Michael could calm a spooked horse better than anyone I ever knew." Eleanor brushed away a tear. "This is the first time I've seen him look alive since the fire. Like there's still a person in there, not just a shell going through the motions." A heavy silence fell between them at the mention of the fire. The tragedy had struck the entire community hard. Michael and Sarah Morrison had been beloved fixtures in Widow's Creek. Michael, with his gentle way with animals and his ready smile. Sarah with her involvement in the school and church. Their deaths had left a hole in the town's heart, but no one had been more devastated than their only child. "The doctors said the trauma was too much," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Said he might never speak again, but he spoke to Thunder." "What do you think he said?" Dawson asked. Eleanor shook her head. "I don't know. But I'd give anything to hear his voice again." As the day progressed, Elijah remained at the stable, seemingly unwilling to leave Thunder's side. The horse, for his part, grew agitated whenever the boy moved out of sight, nickering anxiously until he returned. By late afternoon, Maxwell had made a decision. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, approaching Eleanor where she still sat keeping watch, "I think that horse needs to go home with you and the boy." Eleanor looked startled. "What? But he's dangerous." "Not with Elijah, he ain't," Maxwell interrupted, and keeping them apart seems cruel to both of them. You've got that old barn on your property, don't you? Been empty since your husband passed? Yes, but I'll help fix it up, Maxwell continued. Get some of the men to pitch in, make it proper for a horse again. Dawson nodded his agreement. It makes sense, Eleanor. That horse was Michael's. By rights, he belongs to Elijah now. Eleanor looked uncertain. I don't know the first thing about caring for a horse, especially one with Thunder's history. The boy does, Maxwell said confidently. You can see it in the way he handles him. And I'll come by daily at first, make sure everything's going smooth. Later that evening, as Elijah finally allowed himself to be led home for dinner and rest, Eleanor broached the subject. Maxwell thinks Thunder should come live with us, she said cautiously as they sat at the kitchen table. And what do you think about that? For the first time in months, she saw genuine emotion flicker across her grandson's face. Hope, longing, and something like desperation. He nodded vigorously, his eyes pleading. It won't be easy, she warned. You'll have to care for him every day, no matter the weather. It's a big responsibility. Elijah nodded again, his expression resolute. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand, another first since the tragedy, and Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at this small but significant gesture of connection. All right then, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We'll bring Thunder home. As they prepared for bed that night, Eleanor found Elijah standing at his bedroom window, gazing in the direction of the livery stable, though it was far too distant to see. Or he'll be fine for one night, she assured him gently. Maxwell will take good care of him until we can bring him home. Elijah turned to her, his expression troubled. He pointed toward town, then made a gesture like rain falling. Another storm? Eleanor asked, glancing at the clear night sky. No, I don't think so. The weather report said clear skies all week. But Elijah shook his head, his gestures becoming more insistent. He pointed to himself, then to town, his eyes imploring. You want to go back to the stable? Eleanor guessed, bewildered. Now, it's nearly 10 o'clock. Elijah, whatever you're worried about can wait until morning. The boy's shoulders slumped in defeat, but his eyes remained anxious as he reluctantly climbed into bed. Eleanor kissed his forehead and turned out the light, unaware that less than an hour later, history would repeat itself as Elijah slipped out of the house once more, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Elijah moved through the darkness with surprising confidence for a 12-year-old, his feet finding the familiar path to town despite the moonless night. The air felt heavy, oppressive, though no clouds yet obscured the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the same way Thunder had sensed the approaching storm the night before. The livery stable was quiet when he arrived, the building a dark silhouette against the night sky. No lights burned in the adjoining office where Maxwell sometimes slept when he had a sick animal to tend. Elijah slipped through the side door, the one with the broken lock that the stablemaster never bothered to fix, and made his way to Thunder's stall. The stallion was awake, pacing nervously in the confined space, his hooves making soft thuds against the straw-covered floor. When he saw Elijah, he whickered softly, pushing his muzzle through the bars of the stall door. "Hey there, boy," Elijah whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. These were only the second words he had spoken aloud since the fire, and they came painfully, as if forced through a throat full of gravel. "What's wrong?" Thunder tossed his head, eyes rolling to show the whites. He was afraid. No, more than afraid. He was terrified. Elijah unlatched the stall door and slipped inside, placing a calming hand on the horse's neck. The powerful muscles beneath his palm quivered with tension. "It's okay," he murmured, stroking the stallion's sleek coat. "I'm here now." A soft creak from the direction of the main entrance made both boy and horse freeze. Someone else was in the stable. Elijah pressed himself against Thunder's side, making himself as small as possible in the shadows of the stall. The stallion stood protectively over him, ears pricked forward, alert to the danger. Footsteps approached, deliberately slow and quiet. A beam of light swept across the floor outside the stall, a flashlight moving methodically from one stall to the next. Elijah held his breath as the light paused at Thunder's stall. The door was still unlatched, not fully closed. Had the intruder noticed? "I know you're in there, kid," a voice called softly. It wasn't Maxwell's gruff baritone or Sheriff Dawson's authoritative tone. This voice was unfamiliar, with an accent not native to Widow's Creek. "Why don't you come on out? I just want to talk about the horse." Elijah remained perfectly still, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain the stranger must hear it. Thunder shifted slightly, positioning himself more firmly between the boy and the door. "Suit yourself," the voice continued, "but I'm not leaving without what I came for." "That horse belongs to me." A flare of indignation cut through Elijah's fear. Thunder had belonged to his father. Everyone in town knew that now. This man was lying. "I've got the papers to prove it," the stranger went on, as if reading Elijah's thoughts. "Bought him fair and square from a rancher up near Billings 3 months back. Paid good money too, before the devil broke loose during transport and disappeared." The man stepped closer to the stall door, his flashlight beam slicing through the gaps in the wooden slats. "He's valuable, you know. Special bloodline. There's people who'd pay a small fortune for a stallion like that with the right training." Thunder's muscles bunched beneath Elijah's hand, the horse's entire body vibrating with barely controlled aggression. A low, dangerous sound rumbled in his chest, a warning. The stranger heard it too. The flashlight beam wavered slightly. "Easy there, beast," he muttered. "Don't you go getting ideas." From outside came the distant rumble of thunder. The storm Elijah had somehow sensed was indeed approaching. The stranger cursed under his breath. "Look, kid, I know you're in there with my horse. This doesn't have to get complicated. I'm coming back tomorrow with my papers and the sheriff, and I'm taking what's mine. You'd best prepare yourself for that." The flashlight beam disappeared as the man turned away. His footsteps receded, and moments later, Elijah heard the soft click of the main stable door closing. Still, he waited several long minutes before he dared to move, counting his heartbeats until he was certain the stranger was truly gone. Thunder relaxed slightly once the immediate threat had passed, but the stallion remained agitated. Elijah stroked his neck, murmuring softly to him. "He was lying," the boy whispered. "You're my dad's horse. You're our horse now." But doubt crept in like a chill. What if the man really did have papers? What if he convinced Sheriff Dawson? Elijah had only just found Thunder, the one living connection to his father, the only thing that had broken through his wall of silence. He couldn't lose him now. As if understanding his thoughts, Thunder lowered his great head and gently nudged Elijah's chest. The boy wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck, burying his face in the coarse mane. In the darkness of the stable, with only Thunder as witness, Elijah Morrison began to cry, deep, racking sobs that shook his small frame, releasing months of pent-up grief and fear. "Dad," he choked out between sobs. "I miss Dad. I miss Mom." Thunder stood patiently, offering what comfort he could, as the boy's tears soaked into his mane. Outside, the promised storm finally arrived, rain beginning to patter against the stable roof. "They said it was an accident," Elijah whispered, the words coming easier now, though only Thunder would hear them. "The fire. But I heard them fighting with someone that night. Before the smoke came, there was a man. He was angry about money. Thunder's ear flicked as if he were listening intently. I woke up because I heard Dad shouting. He never shouted. And then there was a crash, and Mom screamed, and then Elijah's voice broke. Then the smoke came under my door. So much smoke. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof now. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the interior of the stall, casting stark shadows across boy and horse. I climbed out my window, Elijah continued, the memories pouring out of him now, unstoppable as the rain. I was supposed to run to the neighbors for help. That's what Mom always told me to do if there was ever an emergency. But then I saw him, the man, running away from our house. He had something in his hand, something that glinted in the moonlight. Thunder snorted softly, his breath warm against Elijah's tear-streaked face. I should have gone for help faster. Maybe they would still be. His voice failed him again, choked by guilt and grief. The storm raged on, wind now howling around the corners of the stable, rain lashing against the windows. But inside Thunder's stall, a different kind of storm was breaking, the one that had been building inside Elijah Morrison for 8 long months. I was afraid, he admitted in a whisper. So afraid that he would come back, that he would find out I saw him. So I stopped talking, because if I talked I might tell, and if I told he might hurt Grandma too. Thunder shifted, lowering himself carefully to the straw-covered floor. Elijah sat beside him, leaning against the horse's warm side, drawing comfort from the solid presence of the animal that had meant so much to his father. "But now you're here," Elijah said, his voice stronger, "and I'm not as afraid anymore." Outside, the storm began to abate, the spaces between lightning and thunder growing longer. Inside, a 12-year-old boy who had been silent for 8 months had finally given voice to the terrible secret he had been carrying. And though his only confidant was a horse, the unburdening had begun. As the storm passed and the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the stable windows, Elijah made a decision. He would not let the stranger take Thunder. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to tell someone else what he had seen the night his parents died. Dawn broke over Widow's Creek, the rising sun burning away the last remnants of the night's storm. Eleanor Morrison stood on her front porch, her face etched with lines of worry as Sheriff Dawson's patrol car pulled into her driveway. "Still no sign of him?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Dawson shook his head grimly. "We've searched everywhere we can think of. Maxwell checked the stable first thing when he found Elijah missing from his stall. The horse is still there, but no boy." Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "This isn't like last night. He would have come home by now if he could. Mrs. Wilson thought she saw him heading toward the old Morrison property about an hour ago," Dawson said. I was about to check there next. The burned house," Eleanor's voice quavered. "He never goes there, never. Says it gives him nightmares." "Would you like to come with me?" Dawson offered gently. "Might be easier for him if you're there." Eleanor nodded, grabbing her sweater from the hook by the door. As she settled into the passenger seat of the patrol car, her mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had Elijah's brief reconnection with the world through Thunder somehow made things worse? Had the old trauma resurfaced, driving him deeper into his shell? Or worse, to do something desperate? The drive to the burned-out Morrison homestead took less than 10 minutes. Even after 8 months, the property remained a blackened scar on the landscape, the charred skeleton of the house standing as a grim monument to the tragedy that had occurred there. "There he is," Dawson said quietly, pointing to a small figure sitting on what remained of the front steps. Elijah didn't look up as they approached. His eyes were fixed on the burned structure, his expression unreadable. "Elijah, honey," Eleanor called softly. "We've been so worried." The boy turned then, his face streaked with dried tears and soot. He had clearly been exploring the ruins again. But there was something different in his eyes now, something Eleanor hadn't seen since before the fire. Determination. "I need to tell you something," Elijah said, his voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to make both adults freeze in shock. "About the fire. About what really happened." Eleanor's hand flew to her heart. After 8 months of silence, to hear her grandson speak was nothing short of miraculous. "Elijah," she breathed. "You're talking. Someone tried to take Thunder last night," Elijah continued, the words coming more easily now, as if the dam that had held them back for so long had finally broken. "A man. He said Thunder belongs to him, that he has papers. But he was lying." Sheriff Dawson crouched down to eye level with the boy. "What man, Elijah? Did you recognize him?" Elijah shook his head. "Never saw him before." But his voice... He hesitated, struggling. "I heard it once. Here. The night of the fire." A heavy silence fell. Eleanor sank down onto the steps beside her grandson, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. Dawson's expression hardened. The implications of Elijah's statement immediately clear to him. "Are you saying someone was here the night your parents died?" he asked carefully. Elijah nodded, his eyes haunted. "They were fighting. Dad and the man, about money. Mum tried to make them stop, then there was a crash, and she screamed, and then the fire started." His voice broke. "I saw him running away. He had something shiny in his hand." Eleanor pulled her grandson into her arms, her body shaking with silent sobs. "Oh, Elijah, why didn't you tell us?" "I was scared," he whispered. "Scared he'd come back if he knew I saw him. Scared he'd hurt you too." He looked up at Sheriff Dawson. "I thought if I didn't talk, I couldn't tell. And if I couldn't tell, everyone would be safe." Dawson's face was grim. The fire investigation ruled it an accident. Electrical fault in the kitchen wiring. "No," Elijah said firmly. "It wasn't an accident." The sheriff ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. The case had been closed months ago, the deaths of Michael and Sarah Morrison officially declared accidental. But now, with a potential witness and a new suspect. "This man at the stable," Dawson said. "You're sure it was the same voice?" Elijah nodded. "And he wants Thunder. Said he's coming back today with papers to prove the horse is his." Eleanor tightened her arms around her grandson. "He can't have Thunder. That horse belongs to you, to us. It was Michael's." "That's not all," Elijah continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Dad was keeping papers in his office, important ones. The man wanted them that night. I heard him say so." "What kind of papers?" Dawson asked. "Don't know, but they were hidden behind the painting in Dad's office, the one of Thunder as a colt." Dawson and Eleanor exchanged glances over the boy's head. Michael's office had been in the east wing of the house, the part most completely destroyed by the fire. "Elijah," Dawson said gently, "that part of the house is gone. Whatever was hidden there would have burned with it." But Elijah was already shaking his head. "Dad showed me once. It wasn't just behind the painting. There was a safe in the wall, a fireproof one. He said it was important to keep special things safe, especially out here where fires can happen." A spark of hope ignited in Dawson's eyes. "Do you know where exactly this safe was? Could you show me?" 20 minutes later, after careful navigation through the unstable ruins, Dawson was looking at a small, soot-blackened wall, safe embedded in what remained of the East Wing's interior wall. The painting that had concealed it was long gone, but the safe itself appeared intact. "Do you know the combination, Elijah?" Dawson asked, brushing debris from the dial. The boy nodded. "Dad's birthday, then Mom's, then mine." He said that way he'd never forget it. With careful precision, Elijah turned the dial, the numbers coming easily to his memory. Right to 17, left to 24, right to 11. The lock clicked, and the safe door swung open. Inside was a waterproof document case, miraculously preserved despite the destruction around it. Dawson carefully removed it and handed it to Elijah. "It's your father's son. You should be the one to open it." With trembling fingers, Elijah unzipped the case. Inside were several folders containing legal documents, bank statements, and photographs. But what caught everyone's attention was a sealed envelope on top, addressed simply, "In case of emergency." Dawson gently took the envelope, opened it, and began to read the letter inside. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he scanned the contents. "Sheriff?" Eleanor prompted when he remained silent too long. "What is it?" Dawson looked up, his face grim. "It seems Michael was involved in an investigation. He'd uncovered evidence of horse theft and illegal breeding operations running through several counties. High-value horses stolen, papers forged, animals mistreated." He glanced at Elijah, "including a stallion that matches Thunder's description, stolen about 5 years ago." "Thunder," Elijah whispered. "Dad always said someone took him. That he didn't just run away during the storm. According to this," Dawson continued, "Michael had gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. He was working with federal authorities, preparing to testify." He paused, his expression darkening further. "The name of the man running the operation is here, Victor Holloway." Eleanor gasped. "Holloway? But he's one of the wealthiest ranchers in the state. And according to your son-in-law, Mrs. Morrison, he's also a thief, and possibly much worse." Dawson carefully returned the documents to the case. "We need to get back to town, now. If Holloway is the man Elijah saw at the stable, and he's coming back for Thunder today, we don't have much time." As they hurried back to the patrol car, Elijah suddenly stopped, his face pale. "Dear Sheriff," he said urgently, "in the letter, did my dad say why Thunder is so special? Why this Holloway man wants him so badly?" Dawson hesitated, then nodded. "According to your father's notes, Thunder has rare bloodlines. Holloway was using him as a breeding stallion, charging massive stud fees. When your father discovered Thunder had been stolen and rescued him, it cost Holloway a small fortune in potential income." "That's why," Elijah whispered, the final pieces falling into place. "That's why he came that night. Not just for the evidence Dad had, but for Thunder's papers, the proof of his bloodline." His voice broke. "That's why my parents died." Eleanor pulled her grandson close as they reached the car. "We don't know that for certain, Elijah." "I do," the boy said, his voice suddenly older than his years. "And now he's back for Thunder. But I won't let him take him. I won't let him get away with what he did." As Dawson started the engine, his radio crackled to life. Maxwell's panicked voice came through the static. "Sheriff, you'd better get back to the livery stable right away. There's a man here with papers for the Black Stallion, and he's brought men with him, armed men." Dawson grabbed the radio. "Maxwell, stall them. Don't let them take that horse. We're on our way." As the patrol car sped toward town, Elijah stared out the window, his face set with a determination that belied his 12 years. The long silence was over. And now, finally, the truth about what happened to his parents would be revealed if they could reach Thunder in time. The livery stable came into view as Sheriff Dawson's patrol car rounded the final bend into Widow's Creek. Even from a distance, it was clear something was wrong. 3 black pickup trucks were parked haphazardly outside the main entrance, and a small crowd of townsfolk had gathered, keeping a wary distance. "Just stay in the car," Dawson ordered as he pulled up behind the last truck, his hand moving instinctively to check his sidearm. "No," Elijah said firmly, already reaching for the door handle. "Thunder needs me." Before either adult could stop him, the boy was out of the car and running toward the stable. Eleanor and Dawson had no choice but to follow, the sheriff cursing under his breath as he hurried to catch up. Inside, the confrontation was already underway. Maxwell stood defiantly in front of Thunder's stall, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Two burly men flanked a third, a tall, silver-haired figure in an expensive Western suit and polished boots. Even from behind, there was an air of cold authority about him that sent a chill down Elijah's spine. "The papers are legitimate, old man," the silver-haired man was saying, his voice immediately recognizable to Elijah as the intruder from the previous night. "You have no legal right to keep my property. Now step aside before my patience runs out." "This horse belongs to the Morrison boy," Maxwell insisted, though his voice wavered slightly. "Anyone in town can confirm it." The silver-haired man laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, a convenient story. A mute orphan suddenly claims a valuable stallion is his long-lost pet. Please, I have bill of sale, registration papers, and DNA verification." He gestured to one of his men. "Show him." The man stepped forward, a folder in his hand, but froze when Sheriff Dawson's voice rang out from the entrance. "And that's far enough, Holloway?" The silver-haired man turned slowly, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculated neutrality as he took in the sheriff and the two Morrisons. "Ah, Sheriff Dawson. Good. Perhaps you can talk some sense into your stable master. He seems to be laboring under a misapprehension regarding my horse." "Your horse?" Dawson repeated, his hand still resting on his holstered gun. "That's not what Michael Morrison's records indicate as Mr. Holloway." Something flickered in Victor Holloway's steel-gray eyes. Surprise, quickly masked. "Michael Morrison. What does he have to do with this?" "Everything," Elijah said, stepping forward. His voice was still raspy from disuse, but it carried clearly in the tense silence of the stable. "Thunder was my dad's horse. You stole him 5 years ago." Holloway's face hardened as he studied the boy. "You must be the Morrison kid. I heard you didn't talk." "I'm talking now," Elijah replied, holding the man's gaze with remarkable steadiness for a 12-year-old. "And I'm saying you're a thief and a liar." "Careful, boy," Holloway warned, his genial mask slipping. "Those are serious accusations." "Not as serious as arson and murder," Dawson interjected, moving to stand beside Elijah, "which is what we'll be investigating in connection with the fire that killed Michael and Sarah Morrison." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had followed them into the stable. Holloway's men exchanged uneasy glances, but their employer merely raised an eyebrow, his composure unruffled. "Now what an imagination you have, Sheriff. A simple dispute over horse ownership, and suddenly you're throwing around accusations of murder." Holloway shook his head in mock disappointment. "I'd be careful with such talk. Slander is a serious offense." "It's not slander if it's true," Elijah said. "I saw you that night, running from our house. I heard you fighting with my dad about the evidence he had against you." For the first time, Holloway's confidence seemed to waver. His eyes narrowed as he studied Elijah more carefully. "I have no idea what the boy is talking about. I was nowhere near the Morrison property the night of that tragic accident." "We have Michael's documentation," Dawson countered, "the evidence he gathered about your illegal operation." "And now we have an eyewitness." Holloway's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The testimony of a traumatized child. Hardly compelling evidence, Sheriff." He gestured to the folder his man still held. "Meanwhile, I have official documentation proving my ownership of this stallion." Unless you're prepared to ignore legal documents in favor of a child's fantasy, I suggest you do your duty and return my property to me." Thunder, who had been watching the confrontation with growing agitation, suddenly reared up in his stall, his front hooves striking the wooden door with enough force to splinter it. The powerful stallion forced his way through the damaged door, causing Holloway's men to back away hastily, reaching inside their jackets. "Guns!" someone shouted, and the townsfolk scattered for cover. But Thunder wasn't charging at the crowd. With uncanny precision, the stallion moved directly to Elijah's side, positioning himself between the boy and Holloway. The horse's intent was unmistakable: protection. Holloway stared at the tableau before him, the boy and the stallion united against him, and something dark passed across his features. "The horse is clearly dangerous," he said coldly. "Another reason it should be in professional hands." "The only person Thunder's dangerous to is you," Elijah replied, his hand resting on the stallion's neck. "He remembers what you did to him, and he knows what you did to my parents." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the stable was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, with deliberate slowness, Holloway reached inside his jacket. "Well, drop it!" Dawson commanded, drawing his weapon. Holloway's hand emerged, holding not a gun, but a small remote control device. "Do you know what this is, Sheriff?" he asked conversationally. "It's a detonator. While we've been having this charming discussion, my men have placed explosives around this quaint little stable." His smile was reptilian. "And now, I'm going to leave with my horse, and none of you are going to follow," Eleanor gasped, pulling Elijah closer to her. The boy, however, didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Holloway, his hand steady on Thunder's neck. "You're bluffing," Dawson said, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Holloway pressed a button on the device. From somewhere outside came the muffled sound of an explosion, followed by screams and the crash of falling debris. "That was just the feed shed. The next one won't be so harmless." He turned his cold gaze to Elijah. "Now, boy, give me the horse, or the next blast will be right under where your grandmother is standing." Time seemed to freeze in the dusty confines of the livery stable. The acrid smell of smoke drifted in from outside, evidence that Holloway's threat was all too real. Sheriff Dawson's weapon remained trained on the silver-haired man, but indecision was written across his face. He couldn't risk another explosion, not with so many lives at stake. "You won't get away with this," Dawson said, though his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I already have, Sheriff. Multiple times. Why do you think I'm still standing here, a free man, while Michael Morrison is nothing but ashes?" He turned his cold gaze to Elijah. "Your father was stubborn too, boy. Look where it got him." A ripple of shock passed through the onlookers. It was as close to a confession as they were likely to get. Eleanor's hand tightened on Elijah's shoulder, but the boy seemed eerily calm, his eyes never leaving Holloway's face. "You have 10 seconds to hand over the horse," Holloway continued, his finger hovering over the detonator, "or I start taking down this building piece by piece, with all of you inside it." "Elijah," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should—" "No," Elijah interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Thunder doesn't belong to him, and I won't let him get away with what he did to Mom and Dad." Something shifted in Thunder's posture. The stallion's ears flicked forward, his intelligent eyes fixed on Holloway with an intensity that was almost human. It was as if he understood every word being spoken, every nuance of the deadly confrontation unfolding around him. 5 seconds, Holloway warned. Elijah took a deep breath, then did something that no one expected. He removed his hand from Thunder's neck and stepped away from the stallion. "It's your choice, Thunder," he said clearly. No one owns you. You decide. What is this nonsense? Holloway snapped. The horse doesn't get a vote, boy. But Thunder was already moving. With deliberate steps, the massive stallion began walking across the stable floor. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path between Elijah and Holloway. For a moment, it seemed the horse was indeed heading toward Holloway, and a triumphant smile began to spread across the man's face. "Smart boy," he said. "You've made the right." His words cut off abruptly as Thunder stopped halfway between them. The stallion pawed at the ground once, twice, then turned and walked back to Elijah's side, positioning himself once more as a barrier between the boy and the threat. Holloway's face contorted with rage. "Enough of this circus. The horse comes with me now, or people start dying." His finger pressed down on the detonator button again. Nothing happened. Confusion flickered across Holloway's face. He pressed the button again, more forcefully this time. Still nothing. "What have you done?" he demanded, glaring at Dawson. "Nothing yet," came a new voice from the stable entrance. Deputy Reyes stood there, a wire cutter in one hand and his service weapon in the other. Behind him were two men in FBI windbreakers. "But I did find and disconnect all your little presents while you were busy monologuing. Amateur work, really." "Federal agents!" one of the FBI men called out. "Everyone down on the ground, now!" Holloway's men hesitated, looking to their boss for direction. With surprising speed for a man his age, Holloway drew a concealed handgun from beneath his jacket, aiming not at the law enforcement officers, but directly at Elijah. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking Michael Morrison's legacy with me." Several things happened at once. Eleanor screamed. Dawson and the federal agents fired warning shots. And Thunder, with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a creature of his size, lunged forward, slamming his powerful body into Holloway just as the man pulled the trigger. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the stable ceiling. Holloway went down hard beneath the stallion's bulk, the air driven from his lungs by the impact. Thunder reared up, his massive hooves poised above the man's chest, ready to deliver a killing blow. "Thunder, no!" Elijah called out. The stallion froze, hooves still raised, every muscle trembling with the effort of restraining his natural instinct. "He's not worth it," Elijah said softly, approaching cautiously. "Let the law handle him now." For a moment, it seemed Thunder might ignore the boy's plea. The horse's eyes burned with a righteous fury, his breath coming in great snorts of rage. But then, slowly, he lowered his hooves to the ground beside Holloway, not on him, and backed away. Dawson and the FBI agents rushed forward, securing Holloway and his men. The silver-haired man, still gasping for breath, glared at Elijah with undisguised hatred as he was handcuffed. "You're just like your father," he spat. "Too stupid to know when to back down." "No," Elijah replied calmly. "I'm just like my father because I know some things are worth standing up for, no matter the cost." He placed his hand on Thunder's neck, drawing strength from the stallion's solid presence. "And because I know the difference between owning something and earning its trust." The FBI agent in charge approached Elijah and Eleanor. "Mrs. Morrison, Elijah," he said, his tone respectful. "I'm Special Agent Donovan. We've been investigating Victor Holloway for years. Your son-in-law's evidence was crucial to our case, but after his death, we lost our key witness. And the evidence was presumed destroyed in the fire," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "Exactly," Donovan confirmed. "Until we received an anonymous tip this morning about a certain fireproof safe and a boy who might finally be ready to tell his story." He glanced at Sheriff Dawson, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Anonymous tip?" Eleanor questioned. "Sheriff Dawson called us after you found the safe," Donovan explained. We were already en route when the situation escalated. Fortunately, we were able to coordinate with Deputy Reyes to neutralize the explosives before anyone was seriously hurt. Elijah looked up at Holloway as the man was led past them toward the exit. "You killed my parents," he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of the accusation. "And I saw you." Holloway's stride faltered slightly, but he said nothing, his expression locked in a mask of contempt. "He doesn't need to confess," Donovan said gently. "Your testimony, combined with your father's evidence and what we've gathered independently, will be more than enough to put him away for life. Michael and Sarah will finally get justice." As Holloway and his men were led out to waiting vehicles, the tension in the stable gradually dissipated. Townsfolk began to filter out, speaking in hushed, shocked tones about what they had witnessed. Maxwell approached Elijah, Thunder, and Eleanor, his weathered face split by a relieved grin despite the blood still crusting above his eye. "That's some horse you've got there, young man," he said, eyeing Thunder with newfound respect. "Saved all our hides, I reckon." Elijah nodded, stroking Thunder's neck. "He was saving me long before today," he said quietly. "I just didn't realize it until now." "What do you mean, honey?" Eleanor asked. "After the fire, when I wouldn't speak." Elijah paused, searching for the right words. "It was like I was trapped inside myself, scared and alone. But then Thunder came back, and it was like Dad sent him to help me find my voice again." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Your father loved that horse more than anything. Except you and your mother, of course." "I know," Elijah said, resting his forehead against Thunder's strong neck. "And Thunder loved him too. That's why he came back to Widow's Creek after all these years. He was looking for Dad. And he found you instead," Maxwell observed. "Seems to me he made the right choice twice today." Special Agent Donovan approached again, accompanied by Sheriff Dawson. "We'll need to take your official statement, Elijah," Donovan said, "about what you saw the night of the fire and about Holloway's appearance at the stable last night. Would that be all right?" Elijah nodded, suddenly looking very tired but also unburdened, as if the weight of his long-held secrets had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Can Thunder come with me?" he asked. Donovan smiled. "I don't see why not. From what I just witnessed, I'd say that horse has earned the right to go wherever he pleases." As they prepared to leave, the first rays of afternoon sun broke through the clouds that had gathered during the confrontation, sending shafts of golden light through the stable's dusty windows. In that moment, with Thunder beside him and the truth finally spoken aloud, Elijah Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 long months: hope. The weeks following Holloway's arrest brought profound changes to Widow's Creek. The small town found itself thrust briefly into the national spotlight as news outlets picked up the story of the wealthy rancher's arrest, the brave boy who had witnessed his parents' murder, and the remarkable horse that had returned after 5 years to help bring a killer to justice. For Elijah, the most significant change was within himself. The dam that had held back his words for 8 months had broken completely. Though still quiet by nature, he now spoke freely with his grandmother, with Thunder, and increasingly with others in the community who had supported him through his darkest days. "It's like watching a flower bloom after a long winter," Eleanor confided to Martha Wilson as they sat on the newly repaired porch of the Morrison farm, watching Elijah work with Thunder in the paddock the townspeople had built for them. "Every day, he says a little more, smiles a little more." Martha nodded, sipping her iced tea. "That horse was the key. Everyone can see it." In the paddock, Elijah was teaching Thunder a new command, or perhaps it was the other way around. The bond between them had deepened into something the town had never witnessed before. The stallion responded to the boy's quietest whisper, sometimes seeming to anticipate his wishes before they were even expressed. Special Agent Donovan had taken Elijah's official statement the day after Holloway's arrest, the process made easier by Sheriff Dawson's gentle guidance and Thunder's constant presence outside the window of the sheriff's office. Elijah had recounted everything, the voices that had awakened him the night of the fire, his glimpse of Holloway fleeing the scene, the terrible guilt that had kept him silent for so long. "You have nothing to feel guilty about," Donovan had assured him. "You were a child faced with an impossible situation. The fact that you survived, that you remembered, and that you finally found the courage to speak, that's what matters now." The investigation had moved quickly after that. Armed with Elijah's testimony and Michael Morrison's meticulously gathered evidence, federal prosecutors had built an airtight case against Holloway. The man's empire had crumbled almost overnight as authorities uncovered the full extent of his criminal activities, not just horse theft and illegal breeding operations, but money laundering, bribery of officials, and evidence of at least 2 other suspicious deaths connected to his business dealings. Elijah hadn't been required to attend the preliminary hearings. "You've done your part," Sheriff Dawson had told him. Now let the system do its job. Still, the boy had insisted on being kept informed of each development, as if needing the reassurance that justice was truly being served. "He's pleading not guilty," Dawson reported one evening, having stopped by the farm to check on them as he'd made a habit of doing, "but his men are turning on him left and right, cutting deals." "He doesn't stand a chance?" Elijah had simply nodded, continuing to brush Thunder's gleaming coat. "He'll never admit what he did. Too proud." "Doesn't matter," Dawson had replied. "The evidence speaks for itself." And indeed it did. The DNA tests had confirmed beyond doubt that Thunder was the same stallion Michael Morrison had raised from a colt, the one stolen 5 years earlier by Holloway's operation. The forged ownership papers Holloway had presented at the stable were proven to be elaborate fakes, part of a larger pattern of fraudulent documentation tied to dozens of valuable horses that had disappeared from ranches across 3 states. The restoration of the old barn on Eleanor's property had become a community project. Men and women who had known and respected Michael and Sarah Morrison donated time, materials, and labor to create a proper home for Thunder and, potentially, for other horses in the future. "Your father always wanted to start a proper stable," Maxwell told Elijah as they installed new stall doors together, had plans drawn up and everything. Said there was no better place for a boy to grow up than around horses. Elijah had absorbed this information hungrily, storing away each new detail about his parents like precious gems. In the months after their deaths, grief had made such memories too painful to bear. Now he sought them out, asking questions of anyone who had known Michael and Sarah, piecing together a more complete picture of the people he had lost. "And your mother used to sing to you every night," Eleanor told him one evening as they sat on the porch swing. "Even when you were too old for lullabies, she'd sing something. Said it was the best way to make sure you had sweet dreams." "I remember," Elijah had said softly. Sometimes I can still hear her voice right before I fall asleep." On a warm Saturday in late summer, nearly 3 months after Thunder's return and Holloway's arrest, the Morrison farm hosted a gathering. What had begun as a small thank you to those who had helped rebuild the barn had somehow expanded to include most of Widow's Creek. Tables laden with food stretched across the yard, children played tag between the apple trees, and Thunder, once feared as a devil horse, stood contentedly at the center of it all, accepting apple slices and admiration with equal grace. "And if someone had told me 4 months ago that we'd be having a picnic with that stallion wandering free among us, I'd have called them crazy." Martha Wilson remarked to Sheriff Dawson as they watched Thunder gently taking a carrot from a hesitant young girl's hand. "It was never about the horse being dangerous," Dawson replied thoughtfully. "It was about him looking for something, or someone, or protecting someone," Martha added. "The way he knew Holloway was a threat, even before anyone else did, it's almost like he could sense evil." Special Agent Donovan, who had driven up from Billings for the occasion, joined their conversation. "The prosecutors wanted me to tell Elijah that the trial date has been set for October. They're confident it will be straightforward, given the evidence and testimony we've gathered." "Will Elijah need to testify in person?" Dawson asked with concern. "We're trying to arrange for him to do it via closed-circuit television," Donovan replied. "And no need to put him in the same room as Holloway if we can avoid it." Across the yard, Eleanor watched her grandson moving among the guests with a quiet confidence that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. He was still reserved, still carried the shadows of his trauma in his eyes, but there was a resilience to him now, a strength beyond his years. Dr. Mercer, the child psychologist who had worked with Elijah after the fire, approached Eleanor with a smile. "I barely recognized him when I arrived," she admitted. "The transformation is remarkable." "Thunder deserves most of the credit," Eleanor replied, watching as Elijah and the stallion moved in perfect synchronicity across the paddock, demonstrating some of the training they'd been working on together. "Gee, that horse brought my grandson back to me," Dr. Mercer nodded thoughtfully. "Animals can reach places in us that humans sometimes can't. They offer unconditional love and acceptance without demanding words or explanations." She paused, watching the boy and horse. "But there's something special about their connection, something beyond the usual human-animal bond." "Michael saved Thunder's life when he was just a colt," Eleanor said. "Nursed him back from the brink of death. That kind of bond doesn't just disappear." "No," Dr. Mercer agreed, "but it doesn't usually transfer to someone else so completely either. It's almost as if Michael sent him back to save Elijah." Eleanor finished softly. "That's what Elijah believes, you know, that his father somehow guided Thunder back to Widow's Creek, back to him when he needed him most." The psychologist smiled gently. "Who am I to say that's not exactly what happened?" As the afternoon wore on, Sheriff Dawson clinked a spoon against his glass, calling for attention. The gathered townsfolk quieted, turning toward him expectantly. "I just want to say a few words," Dawson began, somewhat awkwardly. Public speaking had never been his strong suit. "First, to thank Eleanor and Elijah for hosting us today. And second, to acknowledge something important." He cleared his throat. "When Michael and Sarah Morrison died, this community failed their son. We accepted the easy answer, that the fire was an accident. We saw a traumatized boy who wouldn't speak, and we didn't look deeper. We didn't ask the right questions." A somber silence fell over the gathering. Many looked down, discomfort evident in their expressions. "But today," Dawson continued, "I see something different. I see a community that's come together to support this family, to help rebuild what was lost. And most importantly, I see a young man who found his voice again, who showed more courage than most adults ever need to summon." He raised his glass. "To Elijah Morrison, the bravest soul in Widow's Creek." "To Elijah," the crowd echoed, glasses raising. Elijah, standing beside Thunder with one hand resting on the stallion's neck, blushed deeply at the attention, but he didn't look away or shrink from it as he might have done months earlier. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and gave a small, dignified nod of acknowledgement. Later, as twilight descended and the gathering began to disperse, Elijah led Thunder back to the newly renovated barn. The stallion's stall was spacious and comfortable, with fresh straw bedding and a window that looked out toward the rolling hills beyond the farm. "Good night, Thunder," Elijah said softly, running his hand along the horse's powerful neck. "Thank you for today, for everything." Thunder gently butted his head against the boy's chest, a gesture that had become familiar between them, a form of communication as clear as any words. As Elijah turned to leave, Thunder let out a soft nicker. The boy paused, looking back. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended ordinary human-animal relationships. "I know," Elijah whispered. "Dad would be proud of both of us." And as he walked back to the house where his grandmother waited on the porch, the weight of his long silence finally lifted completely from his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, preparations for the trial, the ongoing process of healing, the gradual rebuilding of a life shattered by violence and loss. But for tonight, at least, there was peace. Fall painted the hills surrounding Widow's Creek in brilliant hues of gold and crimson as October arrived, bringing with it the long-awaited trial of Victor Holloway. Despite the prosecution's efforts to arrange remote testimony, Elijah had ultimately insisted on being present in the courtroom, determined to face his parents' killer directly. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor had asked the night before they were to leave for Billings, where the federal trial would take place. "No one would think less of you for testifying by video." Elijah, brushing Thunder one last time before bed, had simply nodded. "I need to be there, Grandma. Dad would have done the same." The morning of his testimony dawned crisp and clear. Special Agent Donovan had arranged for Thunder to be stabled at a facility near the courthouse, an unusual accommodation that had raised eyebrows among court officials until Donovan explained the unique circumstances. "The horse is essentially a material witness," he'd argued, "and his presence has a documented calming effect on the boy. Given what this child has been through, it seems a small concession." Elijah spent an hour with Thunder before entering the imposing federal building, drawing strength from the stallion's steady presence. "I'll tell the truth," he whispered against Thunder's neck. "For Dad and Mom, for you." The courtroom fell silent as Elijah took the stand. At 12 years old, he was by far the youngest witness in the high-profile case, but his composure belied his age. When he caught sight of Holloway at the defense table, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, their eyes locked for a moment. The man's face remained impassive, but Elijah didn't flinch or look away. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began gently. "Elijah Michael Morrison." "Thank you, Elijah. Can you tell the court about the night of December 17th last year, the night your parents died?" And so, with remarkable clarity and composure, Elijah recounted the terrible events of that night, the voices that had awakened him, his father's angry words, his mother's cry, and the figure he had seen fleeing the house as flames began to consume it. His voice faltered only once, when describing how he had hidden behind the barn, watching his home burn with his parents trapped inside. "I was afraid," he admitted, his eyes never leaving Holloway's face. "I thought if I told anyone what I saw, he would come back for me and my grandmother." "And can you identify the person you saw leaving your house that night?" the prosecutor asked. Without hesitation, Elijah pointed at Holloway. "Him. I recognized his voice when he came to the stable that night, trying to take Thunder." The defense attorney's cross-examination was methodical, but ultimately futile. He tried to suggest that a traumatized child couldn't possibly make a reliable identification 8 months after the fact, especially in the darkness of night. But Elijah remained steadfast. "I'll never forget his face in the moonlight," he said simply, "or his voice. Some things you don't forget, no matter how much you might want to. By the time Elijah stepped down from the witness stand, even the most hardened observers in the courtroom seemed moved. Eleanor embraced her grandson tightly as he returned to sit beside her. "Your parents would be so proud," she whispered. "I know," he replied, and for the first time, he truly believed it. The trial concluded more quickly than anyone had anticipated. The evidence against Holloway was overwhelming, not just for the murders of Michael and Sarah Morrison, but for a pattern of criminal activity spanning more than a decade. When the jury returned after less than 4 hours of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. As the judge pronounced the life sentence without possibility of parole, Elijah felt not triumph, but a quiet sense of closure. He looked at Holloway, the man who had destroyed his family, who had robbed him of his voice for 8 long months, and found that the overwhelming fear and hatred he had carried for so long had somehow diminished. Not gone entirely, perhaps never gone, but no longer the consuming force it had once been. When Holloway was led away in handcuffs, he turned once to look at Elijah. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and for a brief moment, something like grudging respect flickered in the older man's gaze. Then he was gone, led through a side door to begin his life sentence. "It's over," Eleanor said as they exited the courthouse, reporters clamoring for statements at the bottom of the marble steps. Elijah shook his head slightly. "Not over, Grandma, just a new chapter." Spring came early to Widow's Creek the following year. The Morrison farm, once a place of silence and grief, now hummed with activity. The rebuilt barn housed not only Thunder, but 3 rescue horses that Elijah had begun to rehabilitate with Maxwell's guidance. Word had spread about the boy's remarkable way with troubled animals, and the local veterinarian had taken to referring his most challenging equine cases to what was now informally known as Morrison's Sanctuary. "You've got your father's gift," Maxwell observed one afternoon as they watched Elijah working patiently with a skittish mare that had been abused by her previous owner. Maybe even more so. "The horses trust you completely. They just need someone to listen to them," Elijah replied, demonstrating a wisdom beyond his years. "Most people don't know how." Sheriff Dawson, who had stopped by to deliver some paperwork related to the sanctuary's official non-profit status, leaned against the fence beside them. "The grant came through," he announced. "Wired the state's approved funding for your youth program." Eleanor, who had joined them with a tray of lemonade, beamed with pride. "That's wonderful news. Elijah's been planning the summer sessions for weeks." The program had been entirely Elijah's idea, bringing at-risk children to the farm to work with the rescue horses, giving both the animals and the kids a chance to heal each other. "A second chance sanctuary," he called it. "Ooh, for horses and humans. Your parents would have loved this," Dawson said, watching as Thunder approached the fence to greet them, his once wild demeanor now regal and dignified. "Using their land this way, helping others heal." Elijah nodded, reaching out to stroke Thunder's nose. "That's why we're calling it the Michael and Sarah Morrison Memorial Sanctuary," he said. "So their names will always be associated with something good, something healing." Later that evening, as the spring sun began to set over the distant mountains, Elijah sat on the porch steps with a notebook in his lap. He'd been keeping a journal for months now, at Dr. Mercer's suggestion, a way to process his ongoing grief and document his journey. "Some stories deserve to be remembered," the psychologist had told him. "Your story. Your parents' story. Thunder's story. They're all connected, all important." Eleanor watched her grandson from the kitchen window as she prepared dinner. The change in him over the past year still amazed her daily. The silent, traumatized boy who had flinched at shadows was now a confident young man with plans and dreams, and a voice that grew stronger every day. There were still nightmares sometimes. Still moments when grief would overwhelm him without warning. The road to healing wasn't linear, Dr. Mercer had explained. It was a winding path with unexpected dips and turns, but Elijah no longer walked that path alone. Outside, Thunder had wandered up from the paddock to join Elijah on the porch, a liberty the stallion often took in the evenings. The horse nudged the boy's shoulder gently, and Elijah looked up from his writing with a smile. "I'm almost done," he said, as if continuing a conversation, just trying to find the right words for this part. Thunder nickered softly, settling his massive frame beside the steps as naturally as a dog might curl up at its master's feet. Elijah returned to his writing, occasionally reading passages aloud to the stallion, who seemed to listen with genuine interest. Eleanor smiled at the sight. She no longer questioned the extraordinary bond between her grandson and the horse that had once been feared throughout Widow's Creek. Some things, she had come to believe, simply defied conventional explanation. As twilight deepened into dusk, Elijah closed his journal and stood, stretching his legs. Thunder rose as well, shaking his magnificent head as if to clear it of drowsiness. "And to race you to the big oaken back," Elijah suggested, his eyes sparkling with a youthful exuberance that had been absent for so long. Without saddle or bridle, he vaulted onto Thunder's back in a single fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of practice and absolute mutual trust. The stallion pranced sideways in anticipation, but waited for Elijah's signal before launching into a gallop that took them across the moonlit pasture, two silhouettes moving as one against the darkening sky. Eleanor stepped onto the porch to watch them, her heart full. From inside the house, the phone rang, probably Martha Wilson calling about tomorrow's town council meeting, where they would officially recognize the sanctuary as Widow's Creek's newest landmark. But Eleanor let it ring, unwilling to miss even a moment of the scene before her. In the pasture, Thunder had reached the ancient oak tree that marked the boundary of the Morrison property. Instead of turning back, however, horse and rider paused beneath its spreading branches. Elijah leaned forward, saying something into Thunder's ear that made the stallion toss his head in what almost looked like agreement. Then, without warning, Thunder reared up on his hind legs. Elijah balanced perfectly on his back, silhouetted against the rising moon, in a pose of such wild, joyful freedom that it brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. For a heartbeat, they remained frozen in that tableau, boy and horse united against the vastness of the Montana sky, a monument to resilience, to healing, to the unbreakable bonds that can form between souls who have weathered the same storms. Then Thunder's hooves returned to earth, and they galloped back toward the house, toward home, their shadows stretching long across the land that had once belonged to Michael Morrison and now belonged to his son. A legacy preserved, a promise kept. From his place on Thunder's back, Elijah looked up at the first stars appearing in the velvet sky. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind, "for sending him back to me, for helping me find my voice again." And somewhere in that vast Montana sky, it seemed the stars shone just a little brighter in